What are your creepiest horror stories that are actually true? My husband had put up a sign at our apartment looking for new players for our D&D game. One of the maintenance workers came over to talk but told a bunch of obvious lies, then doubled down on them when confronted. We told him we didn't think he'd be a good fit and politely asked him to leave. He seemed stunned that his lies hadn't worked. A few days later, my husband was lying down for a nap, so it was just me and my toddler awake. There was a knock at the door. I opened it, and it was the same maintenance worker. He said his ride home had bailed, it was too hot to walk home, and asked if I could give him a ride. I got a weird feeling. I told him I'd go get my husband. He immediately said, "No, it has to be you," and started talking really fast about how it would be really quick. My husband and kid wouldn't even know I was gone, it was just right down the road. He kept pressuring me, going on and on. I calmly told him no, then shut the door and locked it for good measure. Sometimes I'm not great at interpreting tone and body language, but there was something about this guy that freaked me out. I woke my husband up and told him what happened. He immediately said I'd done the right thing, then ran out of the apartment, telling me to lock the door behind him. He was gone for about 10 minutes. When he came back, he said he tried to find the guy, but he was gone. He then went to the apartment manager's office and told her what had happened. She was very alarmed. She told us the guy's mother had picked him up, just as she had been doing the entire time he worked there. They lived in the opposite direction of where he'd told me he lived. She also said it was completely inappropriate for him to ask us for rides and promised to notify the owners, recommending that he not be hired again to work on the property. A few years went by. We moved away. Maybe 5 years later, my husband called me over to the computer. There was an article about our old apartment complex, specifically about how a maintenance worker there had just been arrested for sexually assaulting multiple tenants. He had used his master keys to enter the apartments when he knew the tenants were alone. Some of his victims were teenagers. I didn't even have to look at the picture to know it was him. When tenants had complained to the owners, they threatened to evict them if they went to the police. Thankfully, someone ignored the threats and reported him. I strongly suspect he'd been targeting me as well, but because my husband worked from home, he never knew if I was alone or not. I think that's why he came up with that bizarre story to try to get me away from home and alone with him. I'm an EMT and, at the time, worked in a mid-sized university town. Lots of student houses and other cheap housing, shared houses, etc. One night, around 3 a.m., we were sent to a very average house on a very average street. The only information we'd been given was that there was blood everywhere, and the caller thought their housemate had cut themselves. We arrived at the same time as the police, probably called due to mention of a knife being potentially involved, though I'm not sure. We went in behind them, and the house was covered in blood. It wasn't thick or pooled, but there were drops all over the floor, and it was smeared up every single wall. I've seen plenty of blood in this job, and this was relatively fresh. Some of it had started to congeal, a lot of it was still liquid, but none of it was dried. I guessed it had been there for about an hour or so. The house layout was pretty standard. Downstairs was one bedroom, a living room, and a kitchen with a back door leading to the garden. Upstairs was a bathroom and 3 other bedrooms, each individually rented and occupied by people who probably didn't know each other that well, a pretty common setup in Europe for young adults or people who can't afford to rent their own place. The girl in the downstairs room had called. She said she had woken up to go upstairs to use the bathroom and saw blood everywhere. She mentioned that the guy living in the room above hers had some mental health struggles and had been hospitalized a few times for self-harm. Sure enough, there was blood upstairs too, everywhere. The cops went to the end room where this guy stayed. They knocked on the door, and after a short while, he answered, wearing his underwear, half asleep and absolutely fine. No injuries on him at all. The cops explained why we were all outside his room at 3 a.m., and he said he had no idea what was going on. He agreed to let them search his room, and they found nothing. The other residents, hearing the commotion, came out to see what was happening. All of them were fine, let the cops search their rooms, and said they'd been asleep until we showed up. There was no blood in any of the bedrooms, just in the common areas. The cops searched the rest of the house and found nothing else, just more blood. There was no attic or basement. The back door to the garden was locked, and when they checked outside, there was no blood in the garden or on the door. They brought in a dog to try and track the scent. The dog seemed to pick up a strong scent inside the house, moving all around, upstairs, downstairs, everywhere, and tracked it strongly to the front door. But when it reached the doorstep, the trail just stopped. The handler said it seemed like the scent ended right there. The cops asked if anything else had been reported nearby, but dispatch said no. At that point, since we had no patient to treat and other calls waiting, our dispatch sent us elsewhere. I never found out what happened. I would love to know what went on in that house overnight. And honestly, I dread to think what the girl might have encountered if she'd left her room to use the bathroom an hour or so earlier. When I was in college, I lived in a house with 4 other guys. We moved out at the end of the semester, but I was the last one to leave. I was by myself for about a week before moving out. 2 days after moving all of my stuff out, I went back to the house to do one final sweep before turning in my keys to the landlord. When I got to the house, the lights were on, which was kind of weird, but I figured I must have forgotten to turn them off the last time I was there. I walked into the kitchen and noticed that the drawers and cabinets were all open, which was also strange. Then it hit me, all of the cabinets and drawers were open, and all of the lights were on in the house. As this realization sank in, I noticed muddy footprints all over the kitchen floor. At that point, I ran out to my car, checked the back seat, just in case, and drove off. I called all my roommates, but none of them had been to the house since moving out. I contacted the police, and they came out to the house to do a walkthrough with me. Nobody was in the house, but we found the entry point, a bedroom window. The screen had been broken through, leaving heavy, muddy footprints by the window. We also had a wooden privacy fence in the backyard, and 2 of the boards had been ripped off. Footprints led from there to the bedroom window. It was super creepy to think someone had probably been watching the house, waiting for it to be empty. Equally unsettling was seeing the physical evidence of the whole sequence of events, tearing down the fence boards, breaking in through the window, and the path they took while ransacking the house. I was cycling home from work, and when I was nearly home, I turned into a side street and noticed a car following me, driving in a really erratic way. Thinking it was dangerous to stay in the road with this dodgy driver behind me, I mounted the pavement and got off my bike to push it the last 100 or so feet to my house. The car then pulled in alongside me and rolled down the passenger window. I paused as the guy inside called out to ask for directions. When I looked into the car, I saw he had his private parts exposed while he spoke to me. I screamed, "You disgusting pervert," at him, and he drove off pretty quickly. I managed to catch his car registration plate and dashed home to drop off my bike and call the police. As I reached the back gate of my house, which is just off the main road, he came back. He pulled up again, trying to apologize for exposing himself while I screamed that he'd committed a crime and that I was calling the police. I was terrified he was going to attack me, so I made as much noise and commotion as possible. He drove off again. I called the police, and they tracked him down at his home using his car's registration. They came to me, took my statement, and 3 months later, he was convicted. He was placed on the sex offenders register for 5 years and had to pay me £400 in victim compensation. So, happy ending, I guess. But it was still absolutely disgusting and creepy. When I was about 10, I used to walk with my dad and our dog at night. During these walks, Dad would always move his work van around because of parking restrictions in our town. One evening, I was sitting on a bench on a residential street in front of a firehouse with my dog while my dad was parking the van in a lot about 100 meters away behind me. As I sat there, I looked up and noticed a white minivan across the road that hadn't been there when I first sat down. In the driver's seat, a man wearing glasses was staring out the window directly at me. The front passenger seat was empty. As I continued to watch, a light turned on in the back of the minivan, and I saw a woman wearing glasses, also staring at me. I immediately felt uneasy. I turned around to check if my dad would be much longer. He was still about 100 meters away, but I couldn't see him. When I looked back toward the white minivan, the sliding door was open, and the woman was starting to lunge across the street toward me. Without a second thought, I grabbed my dog and ran straight to my dad. When I reached him, I turned back, but the van and the people were gone. My dad was staring at them too. He told me he thought they had been speaking to me. He was confused when I told him they hadn't said anything, that they had just been watching me. It's still scary to think about what might have happened if I hadn't run. Looking back, I think I might have narrowly avoided being trafficked during a layover in Istanbul a few years ago. It was peak COVID times, and I, 20F at the time, had a 17-hour transit at Istanbul airport on my way home. Being new to connecting flights, I decided to stay in the airport rather than book a hotel. Before my first flight, a middle-aged, friendly-looking lady struck up a conversation with me. She asked about my destination and, coincidentally, was headed to the same place. She mentioned visiting a friend for vacation, which felt odd given that return flights were being cancelled left and right. But she seemed nice, so I didn't think much of it. When we landed in Istanbul, I deliberately hung back to avoid more small talk, but she waited for me near the transit zone. She asked where I was staying and insisted I come with her, saying it was her first connecting flight and she felt nervous alone in a foreign country. She even mentioned having a luxury hotel room. I politely declined, mainly because the idea of spending the night with a stranger felt weird, not because I was creeped out, yet. She kept pressing, though, and then asked me to help her find the exit to passport control, claiming she didn't speak English. I decided to pass her off to an airline staff member at the information desk. The guy asked me if I knew her, and when I said no, he escorted her away. I thought that was the end of it, but while waiting for my boarding gate the next morning, she reappeared, this time with a bag of fruit, insisting I eat some. I refused again. When we finally landed at our destination, she stuck by my side the entire way through arrivals, even waiting for my luggage long after she'd gotten hers. I kept telling her to go ahead, but she wouldn't. Then, as we walked into the arrivals area, I spotted my fiancé and waved to him. When I turned back to say goodbye to her, she was gone. It only hit me later, after telling the story to my fiancé and watching a documentary on human trafficking, how messed up that situation could have been. I guess my introversion might have saved me that day. To be honest, even now I'm not sure if trafficking was really the intent in this situation. I still hope she was just a strange, overly friendly lady. But given the circumstances, it was creepy as hell. When I was in elementary school, playing outside at recess, a silver SUV parked on the side of the road by the fence gate. A nondescript man, maybe in his mid-30s, approached the gate. I don't know if it was because I was closer to the gate or what, but he saw me and called out to get my attention. Something in me screamed not to get closer, so I talked to him while standing about 15 feet away from the fence. He told me he knew my dad and that he'd been sent to pick me up. I was a gullible kid, so I believed him. I thought I was going to get out of school early. I started walking towards him, but at the last second, I realized, you can't leave school without signing out. So I told him he had to meet me in the office and not to worry, I'd tell the teacher he was there to pick me up. I was super excited about getting out of school early, so I went over to the teacher who was monitoring recess and happily told her my dad's friend was here to pick me up and pointed him out. The SUV took off right as I told her. I seriously thought the guy was just moving the car to park so he could go to the office and sign me out. The teacher immediately ended recess, calling us all in, which I thought was odd because it didn't seem like recess had lasted as long as usual. The guy never signed me out, and I was really disappointed. I didn't realize what had almost happened until many years later, and I have no idea what the teachers did. I don't even know if they told my parents about it or if they checked any cameras, as this was the late 90s. When I was a kid, maybe in 3rd or 4th grade, I don't exactly remember, we lived in a one-story house, and my bed was inexplicably set right by a window facing the front yard. I have no idea what my mom was thinking when she set up my bedroom like that. Thankfully, she changed it shortly after this happened. One night, I was trying to sleep when I heard shuffling noises outside. I was already a paranoid kid because I'd occasionally watch America's Most Wanted with my parents and was convinced every robber, murderer, or home invader they showed was coming to find us. So, it's the middle of the night, and I finally muster the courage to peek through the blinds. That's when I see someone running into our front yard from the backyard. It wasn't my brother, his room faced the backyard, so I knew it wasn't him. The guy stopped and looked around, as if he was trying to figure out where to go next or looking for something, or someone. Then he saw me, staring at him, through the window. I freaked out and dove under the covers like that would somehow make me invisible. Instead of doing something smart, like running to get my parents, I just hid there. In my defense, their bedroom was on the other side of the house, and I probably thought the guy would catch me if I left my room. I was a dumb kid. Moments later, I heard the guy pounding on my window and screaming, though I don't remember what he said. just the screaming. On the bright side, my parents heard it too. They were still up watching TV in the living room, so they ran into my room. My dad grabbed me out of bed and took me to the living room while calling 911. Meanwhile, my mom stayed behind in my room to scream threats at the violent, angry man outside my window, because, of course, she did. Luckily, the police were already on their way. Someone else in the neighborhood had called about the same guy acting suspiciously and harassing people. Turns out he was looking for his ex-wife's house, trying to take their kids, and didn't know which house was hers. He only knew she lived in the neighborhood, or so he thought. In reality, she lived in a completely different neighborhood with a similarly named street. Seemed like a really sweet guy, can't imagine why they split up. Anyway, after that, my bed was moved away from the window. Lesson learned. My family lived in a duplex until I was about 9 years old, and the other family was pretty alright aside from some arguing and drunkenness once in a while. The house next to ours had an older couple, probably in their 50s, and while I almost never saw the husband, the wife was a nightmare. She would constantly come outside and scream at my sister and me, call us names, again, we were children, and threaten us. She and my mother got into it constantly. This lady called me the C word when I was 7. Our driveways were connected, and I often rode my bike around it. One night, it was getting late, around dinner time, and my mom had sent me out to play. I heard some yelling, so I went over to peek into the window of this couple's house. I saw the wife screaming at her husband about how much she hated him, how she wished he'd died, he was wheelchair-bound after an accident. Then I saw her get up and start hitting him repeatedly. I ran inside to tell my mom, and she called the cops, though she was skeptical. A little while later, the wife started being suspiciously nice to me, asking questions and talking on the phone. Well, he passed away. They removed his body, and my mom told me he'd had another accident. Years later, my mom asked if I remembered when our neighbor's husband died, and that's when it all clicked. She had tried to harm him before, but he survived with paralysis. I guess whatever I saw was the beginning of her finishing the job, sadly. I'm not going to lie, some terrible things happened in that neighborhood, but this one was the one that affected me personally. One summer, when I was around 6, my mom, grandma, and I went up to the mountains to drop something off for my reclusive aunt. On the way back, we got lost, so lost that it got dark. This was before GPS, so we had no navigation to help us. We drove for hours, trying to figure out where we were, until we eventually came to a clearing with a line of perfect suburban-style houses facing each other. The houses were all white, uniform, and neatly lined up, but the clearing was carved out of deep woods, with the tree line maybe 5 feet from the backs of the homes. There were no cars, no lights, and no sign of life, until we reached the end of the road, where a massive white church sat in the middle, facing us. My mom immediately told my grandma to turn around. Grandma, though, thought we should stop and ask for directions. My mom got hysterical, insisting that we needed to leave right away, saying something was very wrong. Finally, Grandma turned the car around, and as we did, a group of people in white robes came out of the church, carrying shotguns. We floored it out of there. Several hours later, we found a gas station, got directions, and managed to find our way out of the area. When we asked about the place, the attendant said there was a doomsday cult somewhere deep in the woods. Not much was known about them, except that they weren't friendly. It's been 20-odd years, and for all I know, they could still be out there. I discovered I had a stalker because my friend borrowed my car. I was living alone at 18, female, in my own apartment. One day, while looking for a favorite pair of underwear, I noticed that a lot of my favorite panties were missing. I searched high and low but couldn't figure out where they had gone or why. Honestly, I didn't think too hard about it at the time, and that was my mistake. I had a consistent work schedule, but that week, I had swapped a day off with a coworker. Coincidentally, my friend needed to borrow my car because they had car trouble the day before. My friend came by pretty early in the morning to pick up the keys, and I went right back to bed. Not too long after the time I would normally have been at work, I woke up to a strange sound. It was my front door opening. I sat up and listened, unsure if I was actually hearing what I thought I was. Sure enough, I heard someone walk right in. They immediately walked straight to my bedroom, and to both of our horror, we made eye contact. I nearly froze in terror, and clearly, they almost did too. Without a word, they ran out, and I stood there, frozen in shock, after realizing it was the guy who had done my oil change a few months ago. A few months earlier, I had gone to a Jiffy Lube for an oil change, and the same man who helped me there was the same guy who had just walked into my apartment. After a thorough police investigation, I found out he had been stalking me, staking out my apartment, and learning my schedule. After I left for work, he would pick my lock, steal my underwear, and hang out in my apartment. He told the police that he just wanted to be closer to me before he made his move. This story was not at all creepy for me, but probably terrifying from the other perspective. I had a big dog, and we enjoyed walking in the forest at night. We never ran into anyone out there, probably because it was an old European forest, at night. The dog loved it because he could be off-leash for a bit and run around. One winter night, I was surprised by a light in the distance making its way toward us down the main path. Shortly after, I heard the squeak of a bicycle and the sound of wheels over dried leaves. Not wanting to alarm the person, I called my dog back and walked a bit off the path, where I crouched beside him, holding on to his collar. As the guy rode closer, I could see he was steering one-handed and using his phone's light to illuminate the path. He was right on top of us when, suddenly, and for no apparent reason, he shined his light into the forest, directly at us. I can only imagine how I must have looked, crouching in the middle of a creepy, dark forest at 11 p.m., wearing a black winter coat and hood, accompanied by a massive dog. I heard him say, "Fuck," as he registered this eldritch horror, followed by a rapid-fire stream of "fuck fuck fuck," fading into the distance as he pedaled away for his life. Back when I was 18, I took a year off school to work on some mental health issues. During the fall, I decided to go on a solo Euro trip for 2 months. One of my stops was Munich for Oktoberfest. I booked a double room at a hostel and met Whitney, an American from Wisconsin who was flying back home in a couple of days. She wanted to enjoy the last couple of nights of her solo trip before heading back to the States. After getting acquainted, we decided to walk to Oktoberfest together to see if we could get some beers and maybe, by chance, find a seat, which is extremely unlikely without reservations. It was a long walk, so by the time we got there, we were exhausted and thirsty. Luckily for us, as soon as we walked in, a large group of foreign guys saw us and beckoned us over to sit with them. We were both young and American, and these guys were French. We couldn't speak much French, and they couldn't speak much English, but we made it work. We accepted beers, and as we got drunk, I noticed one specific guy in lederhosen and Whitney getting extra friendly. Eventually, after about 3 or 4 hours, she decided to go to the bathroom, and I went with her. The lines there were crazy, and after waiting a while post-seal break, I returned to the booth to find both Whitney and the guy in lederhosen gone. Now, I had just met her, and she seemed like she was having a great time, so I figured she was an adult and had decided to go back with him. I waited an hour or two before walking home alone. When I got back to the hostel, I was met with a street full of police cars. I walked inside and found police officers waiting for me to take a statement and watch surveillance footage of my hostel mate and an unknown male. The video showed a grainy yet distinct image of my new friend being dragged into a bathroom by the guy in lederhosen. A few minutes later, she stumbled out, holding herself, blood spilling down her legs and onto the floor. As she took a few steps, she collapsed. Moments later, the lederhosen guy ran out of the frame into the night. I will never forget how she looked, pale, scared, alone. The police told me they couldn't give me her last name or any further information because of privacy laws, but they did say she was rushed to the hospital and underwent emergency surgery. She was supposed to go home the next day. I, myself, had a train ticket that afternoon. I never found out what happened to her. Several years ago, I went through a 3D printing phase. I bought a starter printer off Amazon and started printing various things. One of the items I enjoyed making was lithophanes. They are thin strips of printed material with varying degrees of thickness that display an image when light shines through them. I liked taking pictures and videos of the prints and posting them on TikTok and Instagram. One time, after finishing a Gambit, X-Men, Lithophane, I wanted to take a picture of it with a flashlight shining through to showcase how it looked. Even with the house lights off, the ambient light coming in from the window was too bright, so I decided to go into the closet, turn off the lights, and take the picture there. I shut the door, set up the lithophane with the flashlight behind it on a little shelf, and turned off the lights to take the picture. Almost immediately, I heard someone whisper right over my shoulder, "Hey, what are you doing?" It honestly made me jump because I was not expecting it. I spun around so quickly and pushed the closet door open to see who was messing with me, but there was no one there. Even if someone had been there and tried to run out, they would have had to sprint down the stairs to the first floor so fast that I would have heard their footsteps. The combination of being startled like that, only to swing open the door and see no one, gave me the biggest goosebumps I have ever had. I was shook. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything like that, but I 100% experienced something that, at least to me, was absolutely real and unexplainable. Sometimes, I even wonder if it was the start of early onset dementia or something. About 4 years ago, at around 3 a.m., my younger sister and I were hauling some old stuff up to our bulk trash pile. We liked to help out with chores, and we were bored anyway. Being outside at night never bothered us. We lived in a cul-de-sac deep in a neighborhood, with a huge yard and a trampoline off to the side yard. There were lots of woods around us. Our outside light had recently been fixed, so we had extra visibility. We hauled the trash all the way to the pile and threw it in. When we turned around to head back through the side door, I saw a figure on the trampoline, sitting completely upright. It looked like it was sitting cross-legged with a straight back. Its shape was human, but it didn't have any discernible features from that far away. It looked like it was covered in a thin, tan sheet. When I paused, my sister kept talking and walking. I reached out to grab her, and she froze. She looked at me, then in the direction I was staring. We had a code word, a "no messing around, this is serious" code word. When she said it, we both bolted for the front door instead. No one believed us. She was in hysterics, and I was just in shock. It was nearly impossible to sleep that night. I still have no idea what that was. No way it was an animal. It had shoulders. And a head. I used to sleepwalk as a child. We lived in a rough neighborhood, Decatur, Georgia, and I would sometimes wake up outside in the middle of the night, not knowing how I got there. I'd have to walk home and re-enter through the darkened doorway I had left wide open, for anyone who might have been lurking around. The scariest time, though, was when I was about 9 years old. I woke up to find myself standing in my room, with the curtains drawn back, staring out the window. As I fully came awake, I noticed a very large, completely hairless man, no hair, no eyebrows, nothing, staring back at me. He was slowly inching closer to the window, closer to my face. He looked bewildered, like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. The moment I realized what was happening, I started screaming uncontrollably. I was frozen in place, peeing down my leg. The man freaked out, let out a high-pitched scream of his own, did some kind of tumbling move, and then ran off in a weird zigzag pattern, like he was trying to dodge bullets. My mom woke up and assumed I'd just had a nightmare. But the next morning, we found a screwdriver on the front porch and saw damage to the door jamb and door handle. Even now, I just about pee my pants when I tell this story, though now it's usually from laughing. I'll never forget the look on his face when I started screaming, his high-pitched scream in response, or the way he ducked, rolled, and zigzagged all the way down the street. I was born and raised in the southern US, but back in the early 2000s, I decided to move to Minnesota. My original plan was to attend the University of Minnesota for their atmospheric science program. I also knew people living in the state, so it seemed like a good fit. Ultimately, I didn't end up going to college and instead lived with friends. During that time, I started dating a Canadian girl, and my home was about a 4-hour drive from the border up the Minnesota Arrowhead. Just after Christmas that year, I was heading back home after spending time with my girlfriend. It was around dusk when I left her house, which was about an hour from the border. Crossing back into the US was no problem, and I started driving down Highway 61 as I'd done dozens of times before. For those unfamiliar, Highway 61 runs right along Lake Superior, and at that time of night, it's mainly used by locals from the small towns along the route or by truckers traveling between Duluth/Superior and Thunder Bay. The weather was clear, and the road seemed fine, so I drove at my usual 60 miles per hour. That was until I hit a patch of black ice. I completely lost control of the car and veered off the highway. I didn't know if I'd end up in the woods on one side or the partially frozen Lake Superior on the other. Fortunately, I went toward the woods. My car barrel rolled a few times before landing upright in a shallow ravine. The car was hard to see from the highway unless someone was specifically looking for it. It was bitterly cold, single digits, I think. This was before cell phones were ubiquitous, and even if I'd had one, there was zero signal where I crashed. I was alone, freezing, and stranded on a desolate highway near a patch of ice that could cause another car to crash into me. I'm not sure how long I was out there, but eventually, a local man found me and took me to the hospital. Miraculously, I escaped with only a few cuts and bruises. Other than being very cold, I was okay. When we returned to the crash site, a state police officer who had responded told me, by all accounts, I should have died. If not from the crash itself, then from the freezing temperatures. I had no way of contacting anyone, my friends, my girlfriend, and I was at least a 4-hour drive from home. The local man, John, offered me a place to stay until someone could come get me. I stayed with him for 3 days until a friend in Duluth was able to pick me up. I'll never forget John. He literally saved my life. We kept in touch by email even after I moved back to the South. He passed away in 2018 at the age of 70, and I still think about him often. After the crash, I was in an unfamiliar place, at night, on a sparsely traveled road, in the middle of winter, freezing. With every passing moment, as no cars or semis came by, I thought I was going to die. I was terrified. But then John came along, and I'll be eternally thankful to him for being there when I needed someone the most. I'm a corrections officer, which is scary enough on its own. As a woman in this field, I was fortunate to have a very experienced and no-nonsense female trainer at the academy. One thing she always stressed was to trust your gut. One day, my male partner stepped away to use the bathroom, leaving me alone in a unit with about 80 male prisoners. Suddenly, they all started shouting that someone in cell 39 was having a heart attack. Cell 39 was on the upper landing, hard to see from outside, and they were yelling that I needed to hurry up there. They kept screaming there was no time to wait, that I had to go help. But something about it didn't feel right. My gut told me to hold my ground. I told them to wait, saying I needed my partner before I could do anything. The yelling only got louder, with them insisting I had to go now. But I stood firm. Then, just as my male partner opened the door to come back in, they all suddenly scattered, disappearing like nothing had happened. It hit me immediately. They had planned to lure me into an isolated spot to attack me, maybe even kill me. I still get sick thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts that day. I always parked in a specific spot at my last job during the 12 years I worked there. The lot was open to the public, not just company parking, but they wanted employees to park in the back so customers could use the closer spots. One day, my usual spot was taken by a dark-tinted Cadillac. I was immediately annoyed because everyone knew that was my spot. It was the morning shift, 4 a.m., so it couldn't have been one of my coworkers. I knew what they all drove. Maybe it was a newbie or someone from another shop in the plaza. The car was still there during my lunch break, after my shift ended, and even the next day when I worked the afternoon shift from 1 p.m. until close at 9:30. Then it was there again the following day. Something about the car just felt off. It smelled wrong, literally. This was the South in the peak of summer, and who knows what was baking inside that car. My dad, a former Marine turned police officer, always said, if you feel something is wrong, there probably is. So I dialed the non-emergency police number. I felt like an idiot, but every time I walked past that car, it bugged me. I waited for over an hour before anyone showed up. Honestly, if I hadn't been off the next day, I probably would have given up. But I stayed, partly because I can be petty, and that was my spot, damn it. When the police arrived, they seemed annoyed, probably expecting another petty, someone parked in my spot, complaint. But when they ran the license plate, everything changed. They asked for my information, wanted me to contact my manager, checked if the lot had cameras, and asked if I'd touched the car. Turns out, the car was flagged on an Amber Alert as the last known location of a missing 15-year-old girl. When they opened the trunk, they found her lifeless body under a blanket, the source of the smell. She had gone out with her much older, controlling boyfriend, who she was trying to break up with. Tragically, she made the mistake of getting into the car with him. He drove 3 counties over, tortured her, stuffed her into the trunk, and left her there to die before walking away. I never found out her exact time of death, and it haunts me to think that she might have been saved if I'd acted sooner. So, yeah, listen to your gut, even if it seems petty. In my city, there's a canal with several bridges crossing it, one of which is a smaller, openable metal bridge for bikes and pedestrians. It's like a skeleton made of iron bars, with a wooden path in the middle. There are lots of large gaps in the structure. When I was young, under 10, though I don't remember my exact age, I was biking with my parents and siblings along the canal. When we reached that bridge, my brother and I went ahead first, riding a little too close to each other. We ended up colliding and falling off our bikes. My brother fell onto the wooden path, but I was too close to the edge and went straight through one of the gaps. The bridge itself was only about a meter above the water, but I remember losing all control as I splashed into the cold, dark canal. I couldn't swim. I was just a kid, and the only thought running through my mind was panic, pure panic. I thrashed around, fighting for dear life, and somehow managed to grab onto one of the metal bars. I clung to it with everything I had. The whole thing only lasted a couple of seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Suddenly, I heard a splash and felt my dad beside me in the water. He lifted me up, and that was it. I was safe. I was so embarrassed about the whole thing that I haven't told more than a handful of people to this day. I'm 19 now. I have cerebral palsy, but I've always worked hard, both during and after college, sometimes holding down 2 or 3 jobs at a time. When this incident happened, I was 22, renting my own bungalow and living alone. My main job at the time was as a dance, fitness, and play therapy assistant to a group of therapists working with young people with physical, learning disabilities, and extreme behavior disorders. As a full-time wheelchair user, I relied on a cab service to travel to and from work. Most of the drivers were solid, kind, and professional, but as in most lines of work, there were a few dodgy ones. I could transfer fairly easily, so all the drivers had to do was hold my wheelchair steady, fold it up, and put it in the boot. On this particular day, the driver showed up late at 8:30 a.m. I began to transfer, and I felt him standing uncomfortably close behind me. His hand lightly brushed over my back and bottom. It's worth mentioning that I'd had minor issues with this man before. He'd made smutty remarks and repeatedly asked me out for a drink. When I declined, he got a bit nasty, and I ended up reporting him to the cab firm. In this moment, as I was holding myself up and couldn't let go of the car door, I swore at him, managed to swing around to sit in the car, and told him never to do that again. He just laughed and smirked. We started driving, but 10 minutes in, I noticed we weren't taking the usual route to get to the center where I worked. Frustrated because I was already late, I angrily asked him why we were off route. He ignored my questions and, in a cold voice, said, "You know I live around here. I could take you to my flat where my 3 mates are, and there wouldn't be anything you could do about it." I was terrified but managed to reply in my bravest voice, "If I'm much later, work will call me, and they have your firm's details too." He scowled at me but eventually got back on the usual route. When we arrived at work, my boss noticed something was wrong. He saw the driver, whom he didn't trust either, and asked if I was okay. After a while, I explained what had happened to my supervisor. She immediately called the cab firm and then the police, who came to interview me at work and later spoke to the driver. I don't know what happened to him, but I never saw him again. In the late 80s to early 90s in Northern Ireland, I was around 7 or 8 years old. The sun was shining, and it was early afternoon. My dad needed to return a library book to a branch on the Crumlin Road in Belfast, a Protestant/Loyalist area. We were Catholics, and the Crumlin Road was notoriously dangerous at the time, still is, to a lesser extent. I was already on edge, knowing the area's reputation, but my dad seemed calm, as though it was no big deal. Still, he told me I'd need to use a different name if anyone asked. My real name was a clear marker of being Catholic, so I adopted a Protestant name for the trip. As we walked, we approached a road leading to an intersection. Across the way was a predominantly Catholic/Republican enclave called Ardoyne Road. We were headed right, down a winding path, but up the road, near the intersection, was a group of men. One man was running back and forth across the street, relaying information between 2 groups. Some men were staring across the road toward the Catholic area, others were talking to someone in a parked, running car. One man stood out, tall, with long hair, wearing a leather jacket. Even as a kid, I could tell something was off. My dad's demeanor shifted to serious and quiet. He grew up in Belfast during the worst of the Troubles, so he knew the signs when something was brewing. We weren't headed toward the men, so we crossed to the right and started walking away. Then, a woman approached us. Middle-aged, with short red hair, she made a beeline for us. She seemed preoccupied and nervous. She immediately began grilling my dad, asking who he was and where we were coming from. Her tone was casual, but barely. It was clear she was fishing for information. My entire body was boiling with fear. It felt like a horror movie, where someone finds themselves in a town full of cult members, trying to blend in but feeling like they're moments away from being discovered. I had flashes of my dad being shot, of me screaming over his body, maybe being shot myself. My dad stayed calm and played it cool, answering her questions without giving much away. He told her we were from a mixed area, meaning Protestant and Catholic, and feigned displeasure about it, subtly signaling disdain for Catholics without outright saying it. He explained that he was just returning a library book, which he showed her. When she asked my name, I gave her the fake one. She surely saw the terror in my face and heard it in my voice. My dad decided it was time to break off, said, "Nice to meet you, all the best," and started walking away with me. I could feel her eyes burning into our backs as we walked. When I glanced over my shoulder about 30 seconds later, she was heading back toward the group of men. We rounded a corner and started down a long, steep road with the library at the bottom. On one side was a fence, and on the other, a row of houses. It felt like we were walking deeper into danger, with only two routes of escape, forward or back the way we came. About halfway down, we realized we were being followed. My dad told me to run ahead and check if the library was open. I hesitated, but he reassured me, so I ran. Heart pounding, I checked the door, it was open, and ran back up. On my way back, I saw the tall man in the leather jacket turning and walking back up the road. My dad looked calm but rigid, like something had happened while I was gone. He later explained that after I ran ahead, he stopped, turned around, and faced the man, ready for violence. But the man immediately lowered his head, turned, and walked away. My dad watched him for a few seconds before heading toward me. That same afternoon, within the hour we were there, a Catholic taxi driver was murdered on that street. Watching the news that night, I realized I had seen the planning of a murder. We had walked right into the middle of it. I could have identified both the woman and the leather jacket man, but there was no way my dad would risk involving himself, or me, with the police as witnesses against a terrorist cell.